Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles Stories of the Supernatural. And today I have a fantastic lady to interview. Her name is Tui Snider. And she's an author. She's written several books, including the one that I'm just dying to talk to her about, which is Cemetery Symbols. Because as you could tell from some of my shows, I go on what they call cemetery runs, which is I go through all these different cemeteries from the ones in the major cities to those little rural cemeteries. Um, that popped up, especially here in Central Florida after the Civil War. And as a matter of fact, I was discussing with her before we started rolling that so many times, I see symbols, especially on these old, the ones that actually, would write stuff, especially the poor cemeteries. That I was like, I know this means something, but I just don't know what it is. So let's get going. How are you doing, Tui? How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited. I'm glad
Yes.
technology is cooperating.
Oh, yeah. Believe me. That's I did a whole show on that, on paranormal sabotage, where one time it
Oh,
seemed like, after I had checked all my stuff on my connections and my camera and my audio, everything went south. So I know. I call it paranormal sabotage, but I know that sometimes we're at the mercy of electronics and computers and stuff like that. If they don't want to
oh yeah.
cooperate, we're out of luck. But anyway, I know you're an author. You've done several books about the
hmm
paranormal. Um,
Yeah. I'll do show and tell. I
yeah.
brought them all here.
Well, no. As a matter of fact, I'm going to put a link, but I do have a slide with all your last four books,
Oh,
okay, on there, and of
you're
course a
you're
link
good.
to what the about your books. But the one, I mean, you
You
did one for
probably don't
Paranormal
have my two
Texas.
companion workbooks. I'll get into these too. I've
Oh
got a
yes, I
ghost hunt,
saw that. I saw those.
and
That
I've got
those
this one. This is so
Right, that was a
fun.
Ghost Hunters workbook, and the what was the other one?
The graveyard
The
journal for people like
graveyard. I was looking at that.
you.
I was like, oh my god, what is that?
I'm filling mine up. It's fun because anyway, we can talk about it later. I won't.
Yes,
Getting
yes.
ahead of myself. I'm just excited.
So, I'm gonna ask you what I ask everybody. How
Mhm.
did you get involved with the paranormal? Was it something that happened to you as a kid? Was it an adult? What happened?
Oh, it was definitely something that happened to me as a kid, and I pondered all the time. I am the youngest of three kids
Mm-hmm.
by quite a gap. There's like 7 years and 10 years,
Wow.
and when
Okay.
you're the youngest, you kind of know you're when you say there's something went bump in the night, it gets people are like, oh yeah, honey, you and your big imagination, and I admit it. I have a big imagination, right? I get that part, but starting from about age 11, 10 or 11, we lived in this one house, and this continued the whole time I lived there,
Okay.
but it would just be randomly. Now, it would happen, and so this is why I have a pet peeve too, where people think that the paranormal only happens at 3 a.m. or something, or
Oh
maybe
sure.
midnight.
Yes. We could.
No,
You could
because
go
when
on
you're
about that.
11, yes, this is a little pet peeve of mine. Okay, so when you're like 11 years old, your family doesn't leave you alone at 3 at the night. But
Mm-hmm.
what would happen is maybe they'd all go grocery shopping or somewhere. They'd all be doing something. I'd be home alone. I remember the first time I was playing with my hamsters and,
Okay.
and my train set. I had a really cool train set, trying to get my hamsters to ride the train. They weren't into it. I was like, oh well, whatever. When I hear, you know how when you're little and you're told not to jump on the bed, so of
Yes.
course, when they're gone, you jump on the bed. Well, we had this guest room. It wasn't anybody's official bedroom. It was just that grandma came or a guest came.
Right.
It was downstairs, kind of below my bedroom in a room over. Well, I knew exactly what it sounded like when someone was jumping on that bed. So I'm sitting there going, come on, I want you to, Houdini was the name of my hamster. I want you to ride the train. And all of a sudden I hear, bounce, 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 bounce. Someone is
Hmm.
bouncing on that bed. And I know I am home alone. So I was terrified that first time. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, which seems
Okay.
like forever. So
I
I
believe.
I was terrified, stayed in. I told everybody, they come home, they search the house, nothing. They just, oh, honey, you and your big imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I kind of forgot about it, as you do.
Yeah.
And what do you know? Maybe 3 months later, or I don't know how long it was, it happened again. And I mentioned it again. Finally, I quit mentioning it, but every few months when I was home
Okay.
alone, sometimes it happened like at 7 p.m. So this bouncing would happen. Finally, after I don't know how many months, I decided I've got to confront this thing. And the
Okay.
thing about it was, it sent me. The good part about this was because no one, I couldn't explain it. No one believed me. I
Mm-hmm.
went to the library. There was no internet then, so I couldn't
Right.
Google this. So we lived in a university town, and there were all sorts of libraries I could go to. I went to mostly the public library, and I checked out. I asked about this. The librarian was wonderful. She pointed me to the ghost section, and I started going into the adult section at that age and finding all these books on metaphysics, Edgar Casey,
Uh-huh.
reincarnation, and because I couldn't explain this, it turned me on to this whole, what, you mean adults do believe this? There are some adults who do believe this and actually research this. And I started doing yoga, which is silly when, I mean, it's good, but when you're
Uh-huh.
11, you're like a pretzel. I mean,
Yeah, it's like,
everything,
yeah, but
this is
yeah.
easy. I'll put my head behind me. Why is this so hard? Oh, no, only I could be like that now. But, so I'm really grateful to this. At the time, I was so mad because I didn't want to look dumb in front of everyone else that seems so smart. I mean, they are. They're older than me and so much more capable. And but this went on and on. So finally, I decided to confront the ghost. I decided, well, maybe it's some sort of poltergeist from reading. It was
Right.
noisy ghost, which fit. And so I was taking notes on this stuff. It really got me into it. And I go run it down. I put an Afghan over my shoulders, and I had the cat in one arm and a pool cue in the other arm. And I thought that was going to keep me safe. And it
Love
was
it.
thumping, thumping, thumping. I go
Love it.
running downstairs. I'm standing out in front of the door, and I'm going, "What are you?" And I can still hear it, something, something, something. So I kick the door open. Luckily, it wasn't shut all the way,
Uh-huh.
and it stops. And the
Wow.
cat goes, "Rear,"
Yeah,
runs
yeah,
off,
like
and I thought, okay, and I flick the light on, and I run around and put my hands around because I'd heard that it could, by that time I'd read that paranormal activity could cause cold spots, but it was undetermined. It was, it was a basement, so it was kind of cool,
right.
I don't know. But the long and short of it is, it showed me, that recurring incident showed me that there's more to the world than the five senses and everything
Oh,
we're taught.
sure. Mm-hmm.
And it got me, I connected with another girl, and she and I don't know why she believed me, but she believed me. And we would start trading books on that, Edgar
Mm-hmm.
Casey and all these other things, and reading whatever Rosicrucians, anything we could
Right.
find out,
Right.
mysterious stuff, trying to find an answer. And finally, one day when we were about 15 or 16, I think, we were doing homework at my house, and everybody was gone, and it happened. Something happened, and I was so happy. Finally, someone was there with me. So we went running. I was just like, "Yay, come on down!" She was all scared. I'm like, "Yay, isn't that great? There's nobody in there. Come on, come
Yeah,
on!" I
because
didn't
by
thought,
now you were like, I can handle this.
yeah, but I was just happy that someone else was hearing it. I forgot to be scared. I was like vindicated. Like, yay, another living person heard it. So, and I do have a funny connection. Years later, my stepdaughter, when she was little, we
Mm-hmm.
lived out on this little tiny island, and there was a population of 7 out there, and that we were caretakers for some people. That's why we got to live out there. And she told me that when she would walk down on the beach and around the corner to this one cove, she would hear Indian drumming, like Native
Oh,
American, but not
wow.
very often. And our our island was known, like, there were no Native Americans living there now, but it was a special island to them. They would come over and cut the cedars down there to make their canoes, because it was kind
Okay.
of back in the day. And
Uh-huh.
but my first impulse was, I'm sure she's just hearing boat hulls slapping on the water.
Right, right.
But I remembered how I felt, so I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. Tell me next time it happens." And I thought, I didn't want her to feel like I did, that frustration. I
Yeah.
wanted her to know she was believed. And my friend from childhood, who'd heard the something in my house, came to visit us out on the island,
Oh,
and I kind of
really?
forgot about what my stepdaughter had said. She and I are catching up. We're walking along by the water's edge, and all of a sudden she's like, "Do you hear that?" I'm like, "Yeah, it sounds like drumming." And we heard this, like, that kind of doom doom doom
Yeah.
doom doom doom. And I was like, "Oh well, maybe someone must come visit the island around the corner. They're having a drumming circle." So we walk around the corner, and to
No.
that very same cove, we walk up, and we get right to the spot where suddenly my stepdaughter's story comes into my head. She said, "And mom, as soon as I get to their bottom step, it stops." And I'm like, the sound stopped. I
Okay.
got chills, and I'm like, "Holy moly!" And we ran up and looked all around, nothing. And I was so excited. It was kind of interesting that it was the same girl who had, or
Yes.
now she's a woman, who had heard that with me as a kid. And so it was
Right,
kind of
right,
a neat
right.
little,
And let me ask you
yeah.
something.
So
No, afterwards, when you all grew up, Because I know sometimes I've heard of families that while it's going on, they kind of do exactly what you say. Everybody's like, no, no. And then later on, when everybody grows up or sometimes moves away, they kind of fess up that they
Oh,
had their own experiences. They
yes.
okay.
There was one or two things. I need to mine this a little bit more, but apparently there was something going on. My dad would hear something in our house. He would hear someone knocking down on the basement, like the back door, because it had like a little mother-in-law
Uh
apartment kind
huh.
of thing. And when my older sister was in college, she lived there, and so she'd go out on dates and and come
Okay.
home late at night. And he thought maybe she'd forgotten her key, so he'd hear knocking, and he'd go down and check the door. Nothing would be there. He'd go upstairs, and like 10 minutes later, she'd come home. And he thought it was a weird coincidence. So I learned this years later. I'm like, well, thanks. I need to ask them all, like at Christmas, like, come on, fess up, people. What else? But at the time, I
Right,
thought I was the
right.
only
Because,
one.
and it makes you think that the thing on jumping on the bed, you think of a little kid. Like
Maybe.
you know,
Although
that's usually who gets a thrill out of getting on the bed and
I
jumping
know
on
it
it.
was a thrill to me. It certainly got my attention. I sometimes wonder maybe the whole purpose of it was just to get me questioning things. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe it's some aspect of myself from the future, or maybe I get really out there in my thoughts. I'm like, maybe it was just something to keep my mind open. It definitely kept my mind open, and it made me nicer to people who say they had something weird, because I'm like, I gotta respect what they're experiencing, because it made me
Yeah,
less
it gives
judgmental.
you a
So
little
I'm
bit of
glad it happened.
empathy and say, you know
Yeah.
what? I know what it's like not to be believed or to be poo-pooed.
Oh, do I ever?
you know, just because I'm a little kid
Mm-hmm.
and uh
And so I'm always respectful, because I think little kids are. I look back, I had a lot of experiences as a little kid where I'd hear things, or I would just know things that I wasn't supposed to know sometimes, and I didn't know how
mhm.
I knew them. So then I would try to find a reason to know.
Yes.
How did I know that they? I can't think of a good example right now, but just a little. So I think.
Oh yeah, I think we all have. I remember when I kind of did something. I didn't have, because of an experience, but I was one of those library geeks even when I was a
Me
kid.
too.
And but back then
Libraries
the
are
only thing
great.
they had was like Hans Holzer. They didn't have like
Yeah,
all the books that they got now.
I know. Now
Um,
it's like wow, and then there's Google, and there's shows
yeah,
like yours, and wow.
there's a million things, and
Mm-hmm.
he was like the only one out there that was really putting out books. But most of the stuff took place up in those properties up in the Northeast U.S. and but that was
Yeah.
my introduction to it. And I remember it was I didn't have an experience that I really think about it till I was like in my teens, and I didn't realize what it was until later on, because when you're a
Ah,
teenager, you pay attention to
there's a
everything
lot
but
going
that.
on. Yeah.
So what happened? Fast forward. How did you? I mean, obviously you have that interest, and that's
Yeah.
the point I was trying to make. I know what it's like when you, as a kid, you have that interest in it, and it still
Mm-hmm.
keeps going with you
Mm-hmm.
as you become older.
Oh, it does. Mm-hmm.
And and then of course, during the 80s and 90s and everything, more and more authors started coming out with either metaphysical books,
Mm-hmm.
things of that nature. Even though I'll tell you, I think what put me off for a while was back when the first time I saw The Exorcist, which I went without my mother's
Oh,
permission.
oh no.
Oh my
I get
God.
you.
Oh. And it took me
I'm
a
glad I didn't see that for a long, long
no,
time.
my mom had told me you can't go to see that. I've heard that
Mm-hmm.
movie, because it was making all the papers, and I have an
Yeah.
uncle who was much younger, like you said, like a 20-year difference, and him and his wife are gonna go
Okay.
see it.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "You want to go?" I said, "Yeah." And I tell my mom, "Oh, I'm gonna go with Uncle." And she goes, "What are you gonna go, what are you guys gonna go see?" And I said, "Oh, The Day of the Dolphin had just come out." I said, "Oh, we're gonna go see that movie." I lied. I lied.
Yeah.
But then it
Oh
caught up with
no.
me because,
Mm-hmm.
of course, I saw about the first 20 minutes of the movie, and then the rest of the time I was freaked out. I couldn't even look at the screen. I made my uncle walk me to the door. So that night, I go and I sleep with my mom, but I not only sleep with her, I'm like on top of her. She's like, "What's wrong with you? What are you doing?" And I'm like, I
Oh
had to
my
fess up.
gosh.
I started crying. I
My
went to see that movie. I told you not to go.
my older sister did something like that with me. She took me to some horror movie. I don't know the name of it to this day, but it was but we lived in a college town, so they'd have classic movies come through that you could go see. So she thought I was going to see Gone with the Wind,
Uh
but
huh.
I actually go to see like Bloodbath City 4 or
Yeah,
something.
exactly.
And
Yes.
so after that, and they're like, after that, I'd ask to go to a movie. They'd be like, I don't know, you had nightmares after Gone with the Wind, so this one might be. I
And
mean, they
you're
thought
like,
everything was
well,
going to be too
okay.
scary for me. I'm like, okay, I can't fess up and explain what I really saw,
Saw, because
you
if not,
know?
that's it. I couldn't because I was like I said, not only did I sleep with my mom, I was like almost hugging her, and she's trying to sleep, and you could tell she's like, "What's wrong with you?" You
What
know,
is
like.
wrong? Yes,
So yeah, I,
I
I
know how
had to
that goes.
confess, and but yeah, that was the only detour that I think that I took from the paranormal, and then I got over it, and I realized, but yeah. So here you are, you become an adult, and did you
Mhm.
keep on having experiences, or what happened?
Yes, I did. I think I've just always been open to it. And the one thing that I really, this is one of my little soapbox issues, and it's why I
Okay.
created, I'll just show you, how I made that, the Ghost Hunters Journal. And this is
Yes.
a recent thing I made. But, and even while we're talking today, I have a little notebook on me. I've kept a journal for years, for decades, But
Okay.
the thing about it is, okay, here's what I think. And I notice this a lot now because there is, since I don't know, the late 90s or something, all those ghost shows came out where people
Yes.
go on ghost hunts. And I mean, I think that's great. And I'm glad that people are taking, I like it when they take kind of a scientific approach to things,
Mm-hmm.
and try to, I mean, it's kind of hard to, I mean, one of the things about you can't really replicate, I mean, ghosts are circus animals, but just to take an approach where you are writing down what you experience. You don't just okay, here's my thing. It's great to go on a ghost hunt. It's great to go on a paranormal um, yeah, activity and stuff. But you
Right.
need to take time afterwards to reflect,
Mm.
digest your experience, write it down right away while it's fresh, and then and that's part of the that you're going to get way more out of it if you do that,
Mm-hmm.
if you write it down. And the reason is like things that I was on a ghost hunt a couple of months ago, and if I hadn't gone through and just listened to all the audio I just had a tape recorder running, and I listened to 10 minutes of it every day because it gets pretty tedious to sit there and listen to
Yes.
four
Yes.
hours of, but I would just listen to 10 minutes. And, it kind of made it like, you brush and floss your teeth, you listen to 10 minutes of audio, and just to
Mm-hmm.
see. And what was interesting because of that, that's how I ended up discovering this doppelganger thing that had happened.
Wow.
I would not have noticed I overheard at the start of the night, because while we were still setting up equipment, uh, I was with a actual, teams that do it, and they were setting up their equipment, and I was staying out of the way.
Okay.
And my first audio, I had audio going, they had audio going, and one of them, mine, you don't hear anything. You hear me talking. I say, like, I
Okay.
just wonder if anybody's up here with me. But then you hear my voice singing afterwards on the tape recorder next to me. So there's two different tape recordings of the same exact moment. All
Wow.
right, so fast forward to later that night, you can hear another person on the thing going, "Hey, Tui, where are you?" I'm like, "I'm right here." Because I was just to the right of him. He goes, "Wow, I just saw you. I can swear you were just over here. It looks exactly like you. I was wearing a hat and everything, yada yada." Well, see, if I hadn't gone through all my audio and listened to it, and then written down the things that happened, I
Uh-huh.
would have missed that. So my getting back to what my soapbox is, I see a lot of people. I have friends. They'll just go every weekend. They're going to another haunted hotel or a haunted this or that. Sometimes they come back and they say, "Oh, nothing happened. It wasn't interesting."
Yeah.
Well, did you listen back to your audio? Because just
Mm-hmm.
because you did not observe it doesn't mean nothing happened. You just didn't notice it. It's like
Yes.
you go out walking in the jungle and you think there aren't any animals there. Do you know how many animals saw you walk through the jungle? You were like on
Yes.
their radar just because you're like, we're
Mm-hmm.
fairly unobservant humans. So we have to hone our own observational skills. We have to take the time to digest these experiences. And you will see, but it's not like if you watch just on TV, of course they cut out all the boring parts because it's a TV
Yes.
show and
People
they got to
don't
make it,
realize how
they got to,
sometimes nothing happens,
yeah,
or apparently
and
nothing
sometimes
happens.
apparently nothing happens. And then if you don't take the time, which might seem tedious to you, but you can make it so it's not. Like I said, I just listen to. I don't bore myself to death on this. It takes me a while to go through everything, but I go through like 10 or 15 minutes so I can actually pay some attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you find stuff. It's like panning for gold. You don't just go up and look at a river and go,
Yes.
"There's no gold in there." You have
Yes.
to have spent the time. So I think what I'm really trying to encourage people is to write down their experiences. And this, I'm like, did things still happen to me? Yeah, but the thing about it is, I started to notice that I would remember the things that happened to me. But and has this ever happened to you? I was working in a dental office, and I mean, not that have you ever worked in a dental office? I want to imagine. No, I was
I
asking.
know
I was
what you mean.
asking. Okay, yes. Have you? Oh wow. Okay, no, I was working in a dental office, and it was in one of those ones where it was an old house that they had the dental office in. And I had weird things happen to me in the basement a few times there. I don't know what it is about basements and being
Oh
more
yeah,
haunted, but that's a whole nother
that's
thing
a whole
there.
different thing. We could go off on that, but I know what you
Yeah,
mean.
we
Yeah.
could. That's a funny trail. I know I get all excited and go off on it. Okay, but my point here is that my coworker and I were upstairs, and I had to do a bunch of stuff on the computer. She was one room over. She had to do some filing or something, and we were not in each other's, you know, earshot of each other. And I'm
Mhm.
really concentrating on what I'm doing. We'd closed for the night. It was all locked up, and we had about 2 hours of work to do. So I'm just, oh, I want to get this done. I want to get home. All of a sudden, I hear someone just go, Tui, like right in my ear, like my
Mhm.
name, just,
Okay.
and it sounded like a man, but I'm like, is that my coworker who was a girl? I'm like, is that? So I go over to, and I'm like, Christine or whatever. I go into her room, and her eyes are huge. Right when I walk in, she goes, did you just call me? And I'm like, no. And we compared notes because you sounded like a man. It was right in my ear. I'm like, okay, this is freaky, but
Uh
let's
huh.
just keep going. We want to get out of here. Well, it happened to us like 3 or 4 times more that evening, and we were just totally jumpy by the time we left the office. So that's all we could talk about. I rode home with her. That's all we could talk about the whole car ride home.
Mhm.
And then we talked about it like once more. And then maybe 3 months later, I brought it up. I think we were at lunch. They go, oh, kind of like that weird whisper man, breathy voice we were hearing that one night. And she's like, what's breathy man's voice? She just didn't have any memory of it. And I
Right.
think it's because she didn't, I went home and I wrote about it in my journal. So
Right.
she didn't remember it so much so that it actually made me question my own sanity. So I thought, what? So I ran home and I kind of pawed through my journal. Sure enough, I'd written it up in pretty
Uh
elaborate
huh.
detail. I'm like, okay, not crazy in some ways, but that's not my insanity moment. And it made
Right.
me think, if people aren't, I think if people, I call it the weird box. Like if you don't have a place in your brain to store unusual memories or unusual
Yes. We
things,
get
you just forget them. It
it
just
gets
your brain
runned
goes, well,
over
this
by
will
the
fit
daily
into the
stuff.
normal. So
Yes.
yeah, I'll just go ahead and remember all the normal stuff. I don't know where to put this memory. Chuck. Those
Yeah.
are the memories I try to keep. And I think people like you and me and people who are interested in this, we
Yes.
need to cultivate that. Even I will forget things if I haven't written them down. So that's why I decided to make a separate journal just for my kind of woo-woo things and just to see, because if we all do this, you know how like MUFON, the people who
Yes.
research UFOs,
Mhm.
they have databases and they have, if something happens, if I saw a UFO right now,
Yes.
I would call MUFON. But if I
Right.
had something happen right now, who do I report that to? How does it get put into a database?
Exactly.
If we start making some sort of paranormal database, maybe we could go, we could discover that. Did you know
Right.
every March paranormal activity spikes? And
Yes.
why is that?
Right.
We
What was
kind of
going
collect some
on?
data. Yeah, so that's a big thing I'm
Well,
passionate
no,
about.
and
I
you're
think
absolutely right. MUFON, because of course their visibility. Yeah, they have ways for people just to, and they do have a
they have
bunch of
maps.
cases, and they can look at it and say, okay, we got a cluster, or in this area we got a bunch of calls of people calling in. As a matter of fact, a couple of weeks they had a sighting over there off the coast of Oregon. It wasn't, well, it was a
Oh,
UFO in the sense of that it was a plane that they were saying didn't have a transponder. None of the stuff
mm,
that usually airplanes have.
yeah.
That usually, either where who or what it is and where it's going. It didn't have any of the above.
Ah,
They scrambled some F-15s off
hmm.
to go, like, where is it? And
I
then
was
they
going to
couldn't
say, I
find
bet the
it.
military was all over
Oh,
that.
and I can't remember,
Oh,
some of the radar stuff couldn't pick it up. Somebody had called it in because they had a visual. Somebody on another plane, like a regular plane. When the F-15s go out there, they can't find it anywhere.
ah,
And a bunch of stuff happened around that time around Oregon, like two
yeah.
weeks ago. And I know
Oh,
what you're
really?
saying
I'll
as
have
far
to
as
look
that
that
people
up.
could say,
I'm
well,
writing down Oregon right now, so I remember Oregon
yeah.
UFO, so I can.
And it was like that's really weird. Like,
That
what
is weird.
what's going on? And I mean, even some people that normally don't look at it from the UFO angle,
Mm-hmm.
we're looking at it. Okay, is there some type of threat? Is this uh, a plane from somewhere else that's able to invade our
Yeah.
airspace, and then
Mm-hmm.
our
Mm-hmm.
F-15s can't find it and all this? And I was like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
that was really unusual. And a lot of people usually don't pay attention to those things. We're paying attention to it, but then at the same time, I looked at, and there was a bunch of other UFO sightings. Where what I want to
Mm-hmm.
say it was around Oregon. It was like a cluster of like 2 weeks
Oh, okay.
where it just seemed there was a big spike in sightings of either
Oh, all
lights or
right.
things like that. And so I
Mm-hmm.
know it, but in the
Yeah.
sense of what you're saying as far as a personal diary, I mean, I know there's things that I probably don't remember now. But I
Mm-hmm.
know, especially when you go on these, whether it's a tour or a cemetery or anything, that I have found stuff after I've either looked at the tape or listened to
Yeah.
something. I've been like, um, one time I was doing one where it was an investigation, and I'm listening to the audio, and I heard a growl, and I was like, "What was
Ooh,
that?" You know, and that's
that's
so.
creepy.
I know that was like this is not anybody talking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was like, you know, I ran it back like a million. But if you don't, but it's really short. If you're not paying
Mm-hmm.
attention, you just miss it.
That's
That was
another reason I only do it for about 10 minutes or 10 to 15 minutes.
yes,
'Cause I
because
want
if
to
not you
have the stamina to pay attention and not glaze over and maybe I'll miss, get that
yes,
out
you kind of like
or something.
you lose the. And that thing about that you were saying about getting called. I remember one time I was going out to California. I was my son was stationed out there in the Navy, and I was driving a Jeep that he had bought, but he bought it in Florida anyway. I was driving out to California, so a friend of mine staying with me, we end up in North Florida, staying in this old house that had been turned into a bed and breakfast.
Oh,
But at one time, it had been like the town funeral home, because you know back
oh,
then
okay.
people lived
Sure.
and basically had a funeral home all wrapped up in one.
Yeah, a
And
lot of
but that was
furniture
had been years
stores,
before.
they'd make coffins and then they'd be the morgue at the same time. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just,
it was
oh.
like one of those, you know. So
Mhm.
anyway, it was we were the only ones staying there, and they had left us the key. And the owner said, "Look, tomorrow in the morning, we're gonna have a girl go in and cook breakfast for you. She'll be there around 9.
Mhm.
Perfect.
Mhm.
It's two-story, like an old Victorian. So
Mhm.
I remember I was asleep. It was already morning, and you know when you're awake, but you're just lying in bed, like okay, and I'm,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, when you're doing like this laundry
Cozy.
list of things that I gotta do when I get, and all of a sudden, I hear a man's voice call me, not scream or shout, but just call me and say, Marlene. Then I stand up in bed and I looked at the doorway of the room, like I just heard somebody call me.
Yeah.
My friend wasn't there, and I knew she was a smoker, and
So you think, yeah, she's not having a
she,
cigarette.
I was even, and first of all, her voice doesn't sound like a man's, but it was,
Mhm.
you know,
That was, I know,
when
but you try to make sense of it. You think, well, maybe
you know
she just
what,
had a
when
deep
you're in a
voice this morning. I don't know.
totally quiet house that there's no noise,
Hmm.
and you hear that, it's not like, oh, there was somebody downstairs or the TV, there was nothing. And I
Yeah.
remember she comes back in like a couple of minutes, and I said, where were you? She goes, oh, I was outside smoking. She was, you know, real careful about smoking outside.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I said, look what happened. And after that, I mean, I took a couple of pictures, but, you know, since we were passing through, and he was like, this was not a dream. I wasn't sleeping.
Yeah.
Okay. I distinctly heard a man's voice call my name to the point that I sat up in bed thinking, who's in the house? And there's nobody there because it came from like, you know, when you can even know, kind of know what direction it came from the doorway of the
Yeah.
room.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, holy crap. And it
Well,
called
it's
my
your
name of
name
all
too. It
things.
wasn't
It's
just a
like,
vague. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, things like that. Sometimes you get lucky and things happen like that, but then other times it's much more subtle. Where, like what you're
Hmm.
saying, that if you don't take notes um, or something, you miss it. You
Your story reminded me of one thing that kind of triggered me to start writing about haunted places.
okay?
Was in this book I was writing about.
Yes, I
This
saw
is
that.
unexpected Texas, and it's about quirky, offbeat, and overlooked places. But I discovered that Texans can really tell a good ghost story. So as I would be. This was just supposed to be a road trip guide, but I would like, my husband and a guy, we'd go to small towns that are historic, and like we'd go by the one of my favorite things is I look for the oldest person I could find, like find a mom and pop diner and talk to some codger who's
Yes.
sitting there drinking coffee, or like the hardware store, the guy who's just
Mm-hmm.
leaning against the counter not really buying stuff. And then I'd be like, so what don't people know about your town? They're like, oh well, they tell me some tip or another, and then they inevitably would go like, did you hear about the haunted bridge? Or
See,
something
they
like
know all
that.
the
And I'd be like,
dirt
what?
about
I
everything.
know. And then yes. And so that's how I found out about this town, Jefferson, Texas, that
Yes.
is a really cool town. I love it. And Steven Spielberg is on record with having a paranormal experience at a hotel there. The hotel
Okay.
isn't particularly fond of it for some reason. I don't know why. They should be. It's a really great hotel. So I won't name the hotel, but you can find it out pretty easily online. And I do mention it in my book because he did say it. He said that hotel and the hotel, the Stanley up in Colorado, the
Okay.
Shining. He
Right.
said those were the two haunted hotels he's ever stayed in, but this was the first one, I think, because this was back in the 70s. He was like scouting locations for a movie, and
Okay.
it's a really historic town. I could see why they would scout this town. And he got home, or got to his hotel room kind of late at night. The whole crew is settling in. He kind of tosses his briefcase on a chair, and it bounces right back into his hand as if it were thrown. But he thinks, I'm tired. Maybe it just bounced. So he just puts it on the floor, just gets into bed and goes, whatever, I've had a long day. He doesn't think much of it. He's just pulling up the covers and drifting off to sleep when he opens his eyes, and there's a little boy standing by his bed who says, like, sir, are you ready for breakfast, sir? And that was it. He screamed, turned on the lights, gathered up his whole film crew, and they left the hotel at like 1 in the morning and went one town over and stayed at, I don't know, Budget Inn or whatever. But the next movie that he made after that was Poltergeist. So you got to
There you
wonder. I
go.
think he
That's
was,
where he got his
mhm,
inspiration.
mhm. Yeah. And it was like, you at a hotel. I guess because you were mentioning you were going to have breakfast in the morning. I thought, oh, this reminds me of Steven
Well,
Spielberg.
you know what? It was with my same friend. I killed it. We since we were going out there, we were doing pit stops along. We stayed over at the Myrtles. Okay, and
Oh,
the
wow.
Myrtles
I've
has
been there. I know so many people have. Oh,
same
I'm envious.
thing. We're the only ones staying at the Myrtles. Okay,
Oh,
so they tell us, same thing because when you're gonna arrive a little bit late, they
yeah.
you call them and you tell them, look, I'm on the road, and they'll leave you a key
Hmm.
and whatever.
Yeah.
So, and we're staying upstairs in what they call the judge's room, which is up the stairs, and
Mm-hmm.
right, we get there, and there's a courtyard out in the back,
No.
and again, my friend's smoking, and I'm sitting out there with her, and it's right just as it's getting dark, and I'm sitting. They have those little iron rod chairs and stuff out there, and
Yeah, I can
and
just
I'm sitting
picture
out
it.
there,
How
and I'm
nice.
like,
I love sitting out on a porch in those old southern
and it was like
plantations and
especially when you
listening to
spent
the
the whole day
night. Oh,
driving, you're
yeah.
like, okay, I'm ready to like sit down and just like, and then
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden I'm thinking to
Fan
myself,
yourself. Drink a
yeah,
little
like,
tea.
oh, okay, she's having her smoke, and I'm like sitting there,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, and I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I have the distinct feeling somebody's staring at me.
Ooh.
And
Mm-hmm.
the way the back of the house is, it has like that long portico that runs along in the
Oh, okay.
inside
Mm-hmm.
and it goes this way. When you go that way, it kind of recedes into shadows, even darker.
Oh. Oh,
And I
all
remember
right.
turning around, and I'm like, I feel like somebody's looking at me. But
Yeah, that's.
okay,
Mm-hmm.
so we went in upstairs, and we take in all our things, and it's a nice room. And well, let me tell you something. My friend wigged out so much, I was ready to throttle her. She I don't know if it was because we were there alone. And again, when you're alone, everything you hear, every noise, every little.
Oh, yeah.
There's what is it? Was it a Days Inn or Best West? Something that's about 2 or 3 miles down the road from there. We had to leave
No.
and stay over there.
Oh,
I
that's
was
so sad.
ready to kill her. And I was like, she just got so wigged
Oh.
out. She was
I
like,
was
and I was
scared of
like,
the
look,
living than
if
I
there's
am the
something
dead.
here,
I mean,
which
the
there
dead.
probably is,
Oh.
what's it gonna do to us? I mean, what? That we could get that scared out of us? Okay, so
Exactly. Hmm.
so
I
we
know.
came
I
back
was
the next day. They were
at
really
a place where
pleasant, and we
everybody
told them the
bailed once.
story.
That's disappointing.
I
It
know.
is. I mean, because yeah,
And I never had a chance. I wanted to go back and actually spend the night there because it was like, to me, it was great.
yeah.
It was like, oh God, nobody's here. And I
No
think that kind of
kidding.
played with her head a little bit, like they're gonna
But
find
then
us all like
that
the next.
the nice thing about nobody there is that if you hear a voice or something, you can't say it was just a guest in
Yes.
room across the way. I mean, it's really a great opportunity. Oh,
And you know what?
well,
They
I'll go
had
with
that
you
picture
sometime. I
of
won't
the
bail.
guy, that the painting of the man that wherever you walk, his
Just
he
staring.
tracks
Yeah.
you. So I know I see her looking at the picture, and I'm like, you know what? She's getting too wigged out with this. But it was
Oh.
it was it was a good experience. We still had fun, no matter what. We still had fun. We went back the next day and everything. But the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of these houses, they're great, but you also have to put like how can I say, you can't let your imagination run away with you, because then
Hmm.
you're so scared that you don't enjoy it. You
Yeah.
you miss the part where you actually hear, or like And like I tell everybody, supernatural is not an on-demand thing, and a lot of times it's very subtle
Exactly.
what it
Mhm.
presents. And you made a
Mhm.
good point when you have a way to go back and go, hey, you know what? And then you start
Mhm.
thinking, wait a minute, was that the what it was? And then you have a way of checking back and see, yeah, this
Yeah,
is
I like
what.
to compare it sometimes to bird watching
Mm-hmm.
because I have been when I first was researching my book Paranormal Texas on the show again. I'm having fun with this. Paranormal Texas. Oh, this is my travel guide to haunted places that you can actually visit
Everybody,
in
I'm the
Texas.
first one you saw. You heard what I just said. That's how I plan my routes. Is like if I can
Hmm.
stop in on some place. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but if I can go in and stay at some place that's got some type of reputation, I'm there. I am there.
Yeah, so I didn't include places you can't visit because I hate reading about. Oh, this place sounds great, a
Hmm.
haunted hot dog stand. I'm going to go there, and then I read, oh, they burned it to the ground. No one can visit. It's like,
Right,
why'd you
exactly.
tell me about it? I actually did read about a haunted hot dog stand, and that happened.
Really.
I was so bummed. I'm not particularly into hot dogs, but I would have made a
Hmm.
exception to go to that one. But no, they didn't. So yeah, I mean, I went with a bunch of different paranormal teams, and
Okay.
some of them were so noisy and rambunctious. I mean, the level of professionalism really, that's what I learned. That really varies. So
Oh
there are a couple teams
yes.
that I love
Oh
that
yes.
are very professional and they have a way of
Yes.
doing it where they have like a center of command and they know
Hmm.
where everybody is at all times and you go in
Yes.
teams throughout and you never are like I don't
Hmm.
know where everybody is. So if I hear a big thump, maybe it was them. They keep
Right.
track of everything. So, but I've been on some that were so rambunctious. People were running around. They're drinking Jack Daniels,
And it's
and
like
some
right, and
smoking
that's the
wacky
part.
tobacco. I'm like, why are you even here? I've been to slumber parties that were more,
Right, like forget
organized
it.
than this.
What's
Like,
the use? What are you gonna do an EVP? What are you gonna do anything for? If all you're gonna do is capture everybody around you.
running. It's just a party. Run them up in the
Yes.
dark where you're bumping into each other. And sometimes in Texas they turn off the air conditioning. So now running around sweating, people are, where is this? It's ridiculous because they're like, well, we don't want the AC sounds. Oh yeah, but get everybody else bumping around. So I mean,
Yes.
yes, I mean, I really believe that people have to
I've been in that scenario
approach it.
before because like I've been a freelance investigator like since the 90s, and I used to
Mm,
work with a well I still do with a research foundation in Florida, and if something was down in South Florida they would contact me, or if they
mm,
were short on a member, on a
yeah.
body, in other words, they would call me to do it. So and other times I would work with other groups, and I know exactly what you mean. There were some that were really professional,
Hmm.
and then there were others that it was like, you don't get out much, do you?
And then they complain. And then those groups, the thing I noticed too, the groups that are not organized and run around making all sorts of noise, then later on they complain, oh, that place isn't haunted. I'm like,
I was like,
really?
how
So
would
that's
you?
why I compare it to bird watching. I'm like, it's like we all went to a nature preserve together and you were
Hmm.
running around, with an air horn and you're like, there aren't any birds here. I'm like,
Exactly.
nobody
Yeah.
wants to be
Yeah. Unless
around
they're
you guys.
deaf,
I
but
mean,
yeah.
birds or people or ghosts or whatever. I mean, and they're not circus
Yes.
animals. It's just, no, you're
And you
missing
know
the
what?
point.
I've talked to a lot of paranormal groups that's one of the things that we come up with, and I've said it on some of my shows. If you're a potential person that's looking for a group to join, you know what? First thing, look for somebody who's been around for a while. Okay, because in my
Yeah,
experience, a lot of them they dissolve within the first couple of years because
they
exactly of what you're
do.
talking about. Uh, look for somebody and that they and look at how professional they are. Do they have rules? Do they expect you to behave a certain way? I go, if you're really serious about it, this is the kind of group you should look for to join. Uh,
Yeah, good points.
or vice versa, or if you're thinking of calling in a paranormal group, look at how long they've been together and look, do they have any standards when you speak to the person over the phone? How do they come across?
Mm-hmm.
Just don't let
Yes.
anybody into your house for the sake of clearing up because you think you might have a paranormal or whatever going on. But I know so well what you mean.
Yeah, it was an eye opener.
Yes, yes, and but it is what it is. And like I
Yeah.
said, usually those groups, like maybe 1 2 years the most. After a while, they kind of like dissolve because, in truth, if you really do some investigation, sometimes they're really boring because
Mm-hmm.
nothing really like pops out and
Yeah.
is in your face, and so you're just
Mm-hmm.
there going a lot of times like, is that
I
running
know.
okay? The
So,
camera's running okay, good.
yeah.
So
Yeah. Should
yeah,
we
and a
go to
lot of people
bed?
after a couple of times they're like, oh, like you just said, there's no ghost here, and then they kind of like then they don't show up for investigations and things like that. So I
Mm-hmm.
love that like that you put that book that because like I said, I do that myself. If I can do a stopover in a haunted place, I love that. Um, And then, did you have other experiences yourself later on, whether someplace that you visited or you were living at?
Oh gosh, I've had lots, and in fact, I've got. If you want to read about them, people can go to my website
Okay.
tuisnider.com, and I've got some
Okay.
on there. I've also got some in different anthologies that
Okay.
are put out by Teal Gray. There's one
Mm-hmm.
that just came out called Scared Senseless, and I
Oh.
talk about an experience I had with a painting that's kind of hard to explain. There's a lot that goes behind it. By the time we get to the point where the painting was being weird, there's a lot of backstory that explains it.
Okay.
And I had a coffee house for a couple of years, and I had some odd things happen there. And the nice thing about it was my customers would verify for me. So,
Isn't that?
like in that book I was just talking about, I had something. There were one before, Spirited Tales as well. This
Mm-hmm.
one, I have two stories that kind of dovetail. So I had my coffee house, and there was one week where it was like a neat coffee house. I had a little, bookshelf over here, and people would
Right.
do this or that. I had a couch and all this. Anyway, this one corner was dark all of a sudden. And I thought, well, do I need to change the light bulb? Light bulb was fine, but I just bought another light bulb, same, brighter wattage, I think. I was
Okay.
trying to brighten it up. It was still dark over there. Well, there was a whole bunch of other stuff going on, which in retrospect, no wonder it was dark over there, but you have
Uh-huh.
to read the story to get to it. But people would notice it. I had people who, totally didn't believe in. Customers would come up and they go, "God, what's the deal with the corner over there? It's dark. I think you need to change the light bulbs." Yeah, I just did. Oh, and all week long. So it's not just me thinking it's dark over there. Then I had some more like woo-woo people saying things to me. People, the lady from the metaphysical store coming down and going, "Honey, you got some lower vibrational. I don't want to scare you, but I think there's something lower vibrational in that corner you need to take care of." Oh, well, thanks for the latte. She walks out. I'm like, what does that mean? Because I'm in my 20s and I don't know, it's not a lot out there. The books I'd read didn't really explain how to cleanse. So finally, a Native American lady comes in and she leaves me a smudge stick, a sage smudge stick, and
Okay.
she's like,
Mm-hmm.
"Here, you really need this. We can talk later." Because everyone grabs their coffee and they're going, but they're all over and over all week long. They're telling me something's going on in the
Okay.
corner. I kind of know something's going on in the corner, but I also have a business to run and a kid to
Yeah.
raise, and things are nutty. So I'm like, trying to ignore it.
Yeah, no,
I
life gets in the way, that
It
kind of.
does. And I'm like, that's the last thing. I got to pay my taxes. I got this or that. I got a health inspector coming. Dark corner. Who cares? Creepy feeling. Whatever. I'm just not wanting to pay attention to it. It escalates to the point where, uh, and over and over, people from all walks
And you
of
know
life
what?
are
That's
telling me
incredible.
it's
That
weird.
just about like you said, everybody, even whether they were metaphysically inclined or not, are noticing something about that corner.
Yes,
Okay.
very, you know, people who would roll their eyes at anything paranormal are saying,
Mm-hmm.
what's going on over there? What did you change over there? They're just mentioning. No, and I noticed too, no one's sitting over there all of a sudden, unless they're absolutely forced to. And then the people who are more sensitive or open to their sensitivity. I think everybody's sensitive, but the people who really are telling me it doesn't feel good over there. So it finally gets to the point where I'm there on my day off and I'm doing my tax report thing, and I'm having that was also my time, my own cup of coffee in peace, and like then read a book for and write my journal for
Mm-hmm.
a little bit and then go home. So I'm sitting there, but I'm not sitting in that corner either. And
Yeah.
as I'm just then I thought, oh, I'll write my journal. I'm writing my journal, and I got that feeling like someone's looking at me, and it
Mm-hmm.
was from that, and it was like not a happy feeling looking at me. It was not curiosity. It was like I felt anger over there, and I'm like, that is yucky. And I was getting more and more jumpy, and I finally I'll kind of speed it up. I go into more detail
Oh, don't
in
worry
the
about
book,
that.
but oh, okay. Well, I get worried. I had this friend who was, at this point, I was sort of, I tried to approach things very skeptically, so I was not as open-minded, I guess, as I could have been. I just was like, I don't know. Like I said, I didn't feel like I had the time to deal with it. I didn't know what to make of it, but I just felt something over there. I remembered that smudge stick, and I thought, oh yeah, I've got
Yeah.
that in my
Time.
corner.
Smudge stick
I don't know
time.
what you do with it. I don't even know how to use it or anything. But I had a friend who I figured would, and so I called her up, and she's like, oh, I'm so glad you called. I was thinking of you. I had a feeling. Or no, she called me. Yeah, the phone rings, and it was her. And I was so glad. She
Wow.
goes, how is everything? It's not good. I'm kind of, I guess I could tell you this. I'm freaking out. I'm about that. She goes, yeah, I had a feeling. So she and her boyfriend come over. They were an interesting pair. He was like a mechanic by day, and he looks totally normal, like nothing woo woo, no, not like some dude with a
Uh-huh.
ponytail or like a pierced ear. I mean, he's very
Uh-huh.
straight, forward, just t-shirt. And she's just kind of comes from this. She's more woo woo with like the braided hair and
Uh-huh.
Celtic. She's the Wiccan pagan goddessy lady,
Yeah,
who
he's like he's like I'm the
always smells like
mechanic.
patchouli. But they met each other, and they just fell in love, and it was the weirdest thing. So then I discovered from her that he has this incredible Reiki ability, where you know how people do
Wow.
Reiki, and
Yes.
when he did Reiki on someone, I swear, if someone does not believe in Reiki, they needed to have him come and put their hands over their head. It felt like you were getting, you could feel it. Everyone could feel it. It felt like mega tingling. He was just very low key about it. He was very, he'd been raised in a very strict Christian family, but I've
Mm-hmm.
never felt anybody who had that much energy coming off their hands at will. I mean,
Right. Isn't that incredible?
really. So anyway, they both came and they were like, "Oh yeah, we've noticed that corner for a while. We just didn't want to bother you. We knew you were going to get a lot this
Hi.
week, but I guess it's escalated." So they come over and they teach me how to use a smudge stick. And they smudge the corner, and we go around, and they're saying things differently. And I was telling them, yeah, but this is this Native American, and here I'm this, little white girl. What am I? Am I culturally appropriating? They're like, all right, who gave this to you? I'm like, the Native American
It's
lady.
like okay,
Yeah,
she
and
wants you to use it.
okay, they're like, this is a tool. It's called a tool. Like, she said, you play the clarinet, right? Do you, or things that you do. I mean, you're not culturally appropriating wherever that came
No,
from, are you?
on the contrary,
I'm
they
like,
they kind of
no.
caught on that this works.
Yeah, they said this is a tool, and so they got it all cleared, and I followed them around. And another thing that happened before they got there, this dish of forks just fell into the middle of my kitchen. I didn't see it happen,
Oh,
but that is what had me jumping out of my skin. And so that's what gets me. That is like the most simple thing in the world. Oh, some forks fell into the floor. You know what? When something simple and weird like that happens, it can make you so jumpy. So that's when, and then the phone rang, and I was just like, oh, the forks fell, the phone rang. I'm all like, oh, come and help me. So everything calmed down, and suddenly I noticed it was brighter in the coffee house. It finally brightened up. And I was like, great, thanks, guys. And they were like,
yeah.
oh, you're not off the hook, girl. You got to do this yourself every week because you get all sorts of energy. I'm like, what? No, hey,
Mm-hmm.
you guys come in and do that. No, grow up. You've got to clean your own
Yeah.
space. I'm like, really? And so that was, I mean, I'd like to say that, ever since then, I was so good, and I always clean every spot so thoroughly. Once a week I smudge. No, this is one of those lessons I've had to learn over and over.
Yes.
Occasionally, I will really slack off again, and I won't, clean a space. And like when my mother-in-law died, I helped clean out her house. In fact, because the guys, her sons, were just all paralyzed with grief, so I handled all
Mm-hmm.
sorts of her stuff, bagged it
Okay.
all up. Now, some of her stuff included ancient Egyptian artifacts.
Really?
They had traveled the world,
Oh,
including
wow.
a mummy's head, a 2,000-year-old mummy's head, which I didn't even want to touch. Yeah,
Wow.
but so there's all sorts of stuff. So I handle all that. Well, we come home from New York after dealing with that, and I suddenly am sick. I kind of have this weird vague. I'm waking up with a cold sweats, and I have a mild fever, and I feel just my neck kind
Yeah.
of hurts, and I feel like I'm kind of, my posture's weird. Like I'll just catch myself in this weird posture a lot. I mean, I wasn't quite like that. I'm overdoing it. I wasn't walking around
Right.
like.
No, I know, but you're at some point you caught on like, what's up?
Well, I was really dense. I hate to admit, but my friend came to visit, and the minute she walked in the door, she's like, "Oh, hey, what's been going on?" And I tell her, she's like, "Yeah, did you bring anything home from your mother-in-law's place?" "Oh, yeah, she gave me these tiki mugs because I love tiki stuff, and this Irish tablecloth. I mean, she'd left them for me."
Right.
And she goes, "Yeah, that's not all you brought, honey." I'm like, "What?" She goes, and I'm like, "What?" She goes, how you feeling lately?" I'm like, because she just picked up on it. My friend's very sensitive. She's picked up on it instantly.
Uh
We
huh.
cleansed, got rid of it, and suddenly I was like, "Oh, I feel like you just gave me a chiropractic adjustment. My temperature. I had a doctor's appointment scheduled
Oh,
because I was having
what?
those. I didn't have it to schedule it, so I was like, oh, but I'd slacked off on the old
And then you think
spiritual hygiene.
who was the culprit? But like you said, you handled all the stuff from
she
all over the
she told me,
world.
yeah, and I wanted to. I said, I want to know more about it, and she said, no, you don't engage, don't give it any energy. See,
Hmm.
my curiosity is like, oh, I want to know exactly if I've got a boogie. I want to know its name, its
Right.
history. She goes,
Exactly.
no, you don't, because then you give it more of your energy, then you give it more entrance into your life, then you give it like
Yes.
permission to bug you. And I'm like, oh, well, I kind of sucks. It's kind of like the whole, in Harry Potter, Voldemort. You don't say his name.
I
Sort of
know.
like that.
You
I
know
kind of
what? And
understand
then
that. I'm like, I get it.
that's what a lot of people don't real. I mean, because I'm the first one. I'm like you. I'm curious sometimes. Like I
Yeah.
want to know what is it, where did it come from, why is it here, why,
Yeah.
or how, or
Mm-hmm.
who, and
Yes.
I understand though that sometimes just letting it, like ignoring it, and it kind of like dissipates on its own, goes elsewhere,
Yeah.
whatever, whatever the case might be.
Mm-hmm.
A lot less headache for you because it's almost like once um, I don't know. I don't know if you ever read that series from Dean Koontz called Odd Thomas,
No,
and
I didn't.
the main guy, he's written like five or six. He's psychic. He can see dead people. He sees Elvis. He
Oh,
sees
okay.
Sinatra. But one of the things he can
Wow.
see is wherever there's going to be some type of major catastrophe with a lot of deaths, he sees
Oh.
these
Mm-hmm.
black, they're not shadow people, but they're blackish, like they're creatures. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things he always says was, I never let them know that I can see them.
Yeah.
Because once they're aware that I could see them, then it's like the jig is up.
It calls
In other
attention to
words,
yourself, I guess. Yeah.
right. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, it's the same thing where sometimes you're just better off not engaging with it, because then what
Yeah.
happens is they become aware of you, because like, oh, she's aware of me, she sees me, or she's
Mm-hmm.
trying to fuel the fire. So yeah, I totally agree with that. Your friend's
Yeah.
instructions, like let it go, let it go. You can live without knowing about it.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, I've got enough things that I can research. I love researching things. I'm like, okay, I will
Mm-hmm.
research other things. I won't just
Yes,
dwell,
exactly.
concentrate on what you want to grow. So maybe I'll look up someone,
Sometimes like it
someone
was
else.
like curiosity. What was that? Curiosity killed the cat.
But satisfaction brought it
The
back.
brag. I
See,
know.
that's what I know.
Yeah, I can
Oh
tell you.
well.
We are liking that. So, how did
Yeah.
you, when that book that you wrote about the cemetery symbols, which I think
Mhm.
is, like I said, because of all the cemeteries, how did you
I'll
decide to
show
write that
it.
book?
Oh yeah. So, well, a few things got me to write that. So here's the one: Understanding
Mm-hmm.
Cemetery Symbols. It's a
Yes.
pretty basic title because I want people who are, these days you search up, gee, I want to understand cemetery symbols. I want you to find my book because,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So like I mentioned, I do love research and researching, and I do love cemeteries. I mean, I've
Okay.
loved them since I was a kid. I actually, when I was 9 years old, this creepy dude janitor tried to kidnap my friend and I. He locked us in a room, this and that, and
Are you
we had gone.
serious?
I am. This
Oh
is
my
in Virginia.
God.
Hmm. Yes, and we got away because, well, anyway, long story short, it was supposed to be a Girl Scout meeting that day. We didn't know it was canceled. So we showed up at the church and no one was there. And this dude, he's all nice and he leads us into this back room. And we suddenly realized we can't get out, that he is keeping us in. So we climb out. It was a bit of a jump for a 9-year-old still, but we made it out. And we were walking home. We were like, well, that was weird. Why did he lock us in that room? Why did he want to kill us? He pulls up in his car, and
Oh,
we managed to escape by running across the street into the graveyard. And we knew this graveyard so well because we played there a lot. So we knew exactly how to zigzag through it.
right.
And if we had zigzagged through it and then we got to a path in the woods and we got home, that let us out, and he
Right.
wasn't able, but we could hear he was chasing it. Come back, girls, come back!
Oh, he
And
went
he
in
was
there after you
bumping.
guys?
Yeah,
Oh
he
my
went in with his
God.
car because
Oh,
there was a little
Tui,
road,
I
and then
would
and
have.
then he, and then he
Oh,
got out of the car and started chasing us, and we were running. And luckily, we knew it so well, we weren't tripping or falling because we had played tag, we
right.
played chase, we had all sorts of games. We played vampire, we had all these different
Mm-hmm.
games in there. That was one of our favorite places to play because it just fired our imagination, and it was pretty. It was a historic graveyard.
Uh-huh.
Well, thank goodness, because if it had been a modern one that you could go over, he could have caught us. I don't know what would have happened, and our parents didn't believe us. So yeah, so I know I want to visit that cemetery again. That's up in
Let me
Virginia,
ask you,
and
wait. did you tell your parents? They didn't believe you guys, or what happened?
They didn't believe us. Mm-mm. She and I, this one girl, I mean, we would get in trouble sometimes because she was a little bit more
Oh
of a
my
troublemaker
God!
than me.
But
I
let me
was,
ask you
but yeah,
something.
they didn't believe us. Mm-mm. So nowadays, I think they would, but I think there's more awareness now. But
But
whatever,
that
they
is, let
didn't
me tell you
believe us.
something. That must have been such. This is like straight out of a horror film. You got the monster as in the real one
Hmm.
chasing you. Holy
You
crap!
know, it really, even to this day, I mean, I always wear shoes that I can run in. Like, I don't like to wear shoes that I don't think I could just take off running. I mean, now I'll wear shoes maybe a little, like if I'm on a date
Right,
with my
right.
husband, maybe not so running,
Mm-hmm.
but for years, I mean, I was like, forget it. I just was like, I want to be able to take off running if I need to. And when I sit in a
I
restaurant or
don't blame
something,
you.
I like
I,
look to see where the escape routes are. I mean, because we had to escape, we had to use our wits, and the adults didn't believe us. So
let me tell
those
you
were
something.
some
I would have.
things as a
I
kid.
probably would have worn sneakers just about for everything. I mean,
Yeah,
I'd be like,
I, mm, I was so glad that we, had our wits about us to get away. To us, it was like, wow, that was. I remember us saying, wow, that was like a Disney movie. We escaped from a bad guy. We were really impressed with ourselves.
yeah, you know what? And it's like the innocence of a kid that you kind of like.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, even though you ran away from the danger, you kind
Mm-hmm.
of also underestimate or unaware of just.
I look, yeah, when I had a daughter of my own, my stepdaughter, I look back and I'm like, whoa, man,
Yeah.
I would have gone over to that church and read him the riot act, but for
But it
whatever
makes you
reason,
wonder,
I don't
had this
like.
guy
I
done
talked
this
about them
before?
since.
Did he ever do
They're
it again? I take it you guys never went back over there again.
No, we moved away shortly after. It was like a lot going on in my family right about then, and we ended up moving to Washington State shortly
And
after.
you were like, okay.
But I never, it always made me a little nervous of janitors. I mean, and like just being alone with an adult, I just kind of was like, from
And you
that
know
point
what?
on, like,
It
I'm
was,
ready to flee, flee. How can I,
well,
where's the escape route? I would pay
you know
attention
what?
after that.
And this is the thing, yeah, we teach kids to be careful with strangers, but,
Hmm.
somebody that does janitorial work, you really don't see him as a stranger per se.
No,
He's usually in the background because he's got an excuse to be there because he's cleaning,
he's a
so,
trusted person with lots of keys.
well,
We told us, oh, girls, they moved the meeting down to here, to this room. And then all
right.
of a sudden he's, locking us in there, and we realized this is just not good. And he's like, no, no, just stay. And I'm like, no. And
Well,
that
thank
was
God you
very
guys had your
creepy.
wits about you and,
Hmm.
self-preservation kicked in. But it's like
Yeah.
same thing, and for kids, you're thinking, okay, if the adults have given him a job, like you said, he's got the keys,
Hmm.
so I
I
guess
should
he's
trust him.
okay. Huh? He's
He
okay.
told us he knows what's going on. Oh, okay. We forgot. We're kids.
Oh
We
my
forget stuff.
God, Tui, that what
But
a
yeah.
story.
So graveyards
God,
and me, we go back.
that is
Yeah.
incredible. And I'm
It
glad
was
it turned out
scary.
with a happy ending for you guys. I really am.
Yes.
You were
Yes.
smart girls. You guys like, that's it. We're out of here. I
Yeah.
wonder, you know
So
what? I wonder because I see I'm doing the I wonder if this guy like left town like think I wonder if they're going to go home and tell their parents, "Let me get the heck out of Dodge before."
I don't know. I know.
Because
He had kind of a Swedish accent. I remember. Yeah, this is one of those things. I mean, yeah. Yeah, he was really nice to us at first and
oh
seemed
yeah, of
fine.
course.
And then all of a sudden we realized, look, he's trapped us here. And we just had this moment where we looked at each other and we realized we got to get out. I'm like, the window. And luckily he was, across the room enough that we could get that window pried up enough and climb out. I mean, it was just all, it could have gone such
You
a
know
different
what?
way.
That
We
could
were
have
really
had a
lucky.
really bad ending,
She was making a
unfortunately.
phone call to somebody too, which so I don't know what was up. I mean, was he going to sell it? I mean, I look back and I'm like, God, that just could have been so bad. And I
You
don't
know
know,
what?
but
He
as
could have been
years go
calling an
by,
accomplice. He could have been like, or like what you
maybe.
said, hey, oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's what
I
I'm saying.
don't
That could have
know.
been turned out to have a really horrible end.
Yeah, yeah.
But that
So
is such a
anyway,
good story after the fact, but it's such a good
yes,
story.
after the fact, and at the time it was just I don't know, whatever, but it did have lasting impression. And my friend, my parents, well, we weren't allowed to play with each other anymore. Our parents were so mad at us
Really?
for that. Yes, it was a kind of a weird thing,
Wow.
but so I don't know, whatever. I'd love to find her, track her down, and find out if she,
What
then I
became?
just we split town, a few weeks
Yeah, yeah,
later.
yeah,
We moved,
yeah.
so it wasn't like I
Right.
didn't really
No,
get
when you're a
to.
kid, you got no choice. Your family moves out of town. What are you gonna do? You gotta go. And
Yeah, so
And like you
I
said,
don't
it's
know if
not
you.
like now you got social media and other ways that you can communicate
Hmm.
with a person. That's it. Once you're out of town, you lose touch with everybody,
Hmm.
especially if you're a
And
child.
yeah, and it's just like, okay, new chapter, new beginning. I'm moving to Washington State. It's kind of different from Virginia, that's for sure. But yeah, so that was one. I just always, to me, I think graveyards and cemeteries are just refuges. And I think a, a thing that I really want people to get from my book and to understand, or one thing that I'm out to promote, is that we mistakenly, and it's because of Hollywood and
Mm-hmm.
our idea of what a cemetery is and what it's become. Now, what it's become in modern days, it's just become a place where you take a dead person, you tuck them in the ground, or you toss their ashes, and then you go. You don't
Mm-hmm.
go back. But they used to be, like in the 1800s and even going back to Greek times. It's a time honored tradition to have a picnic in the cemetery.
Right. They were like parks,
To
right?
spend, yes, they were garden cemeteries of America and Europe. They were meant to be places you would go. They were actually America's first national, I mean, not national park, first public parks. They didn't have
Okay.
public parks in cities. They had what they had were, I should tell you, there's a difference between a graveyard and a cemetery. A graveyard, if you want to be technical, I use the words interchangeably, but if you wanted, you were on Jeopardy or some, you had to know the difference. A graveyard is when people are buried around a church, and
Okay.
that was what they that's how it kind of began. If you were, unless you were living out in the countryside, but if you lived in the city, especially, and in the country, you'd be buried around a church. So that's a graveyard. A
Mm-hmm.
cemetery, it comes from a Greek word. I think it's koimetrion, which means a place to sleep, like a sleeping chamber. And
Okay.
that came along with the Victorian era because they liked the whole euphemism of sleep for death. And cemeteries are land that's just been put aside to bury people, not necessarily attached to a church.
Okay.
So what happened by the 1800s, if you start burying people around the little churchyard, you've only got so much room, and so you just start
Exactly.
burying them on top of each other. And
Mm-hmm.
there's coveted spaces. Especially some of these traditions came across the pond with us when the European settlers came to
Mm-hmm.
America. But there would be the north side of the church might have been for like suicides and the bad people, quote unquote, less than holy people. There was like a pecking order. The east side of the church, because you wanted to face east on Judgment Day, might be a um, more coveted spot. But
Wow.
but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, or behind myself, or whatever. I'm getting off the topic.
Well,
Okay, the
no, no,
topic
but you
is
know what?
that.
That's interesting because that's stuff that
Mm-hmm,
people don't realize that people cared about, I guess, back then.
mm-hmm. Yeah, they really did. Oh, it's really fascinating. So at one point in the 1800s, it started to happen that these graveyards were so overcrowded that, let's say there was a big flood or a big storm, or just the wall would weaken, the church wall would weaken and collapse, spilling corpses into the streets.
Wow.
Yeah, and even then, although they didn't understand germs to the degree we do, they knew this was a health hazard. Plus, it's horrifying to see.
Mm-hmm.
Did not smell good or look good or
Sure.
yuck. So what are we going to do? Well, in America, we looked to see what they were doing in Europe because they were having the same problem in Europe. In Europe, like in Paris, there are these huge catacombs where
Yeah.
all these bodies, that they just kind of turned into skeletons and stacked neatly down below the street because they were running out of room in the city area. So some person had a very smart idea. Let's make a cemetery outside of the city limits where it'll be a nice, like a sculpture park where people
Mm-hmm.
can go and visit. And like, so now that's why they created Père Lachaise, which is really still to this day a top tourist destination. I haven't been. I need to go to Père Lachaise. But lots of
Okay.
people, famous people, are buried there. Oscar
Uh-huh.
Wilde
Yeah.
and Jim Morrison, and it's just gorgeous. Every photo I've ever seen of it, there's really opulent statues. So what they did in Massachusetts, they did the same thing. The people of Boston, they thought, we're having this overcrowding in the city. Let's make a cemetery, a garden cemetery. So they
Okay.
created Mount Auburn Garden Cemetery. I think it was 1831, right around there. And it became a very popular destination for city dwellers. Let's go out for the weekend. They would
Mm.
have carriage races. They would even shoot game. Kids could run around.
Right.
Artists would set up their easels. Ladies could stroll. And you had this beautiful monuments, cemetery monuments. And during the Victorian era, really gorgeous monuments kind of became the thing. And I think you and I were talking about before this interview started. This was really the heyday for cemetery symbols. Was during the Victorian era, so you see these
Mm-hmm.
really glorious symbols. So yeah, so that was just so when people, my thought, I so we still have these. America has a lot of garden cemeteries, and then places that don't have the fancy garden cemeteries. There's beautiful rural cemeteries all throughout Texas. We have a lot of gorgeous rural ones. These ones are a little different. They usually have, even today, some of them still have a homecoming day or a decoration day
Right.
where you will come and clean up and have a
Yes, I
picnic, and
know.
like you
I've
will go to
seen.
this cemetery. Isn't that
Hmm.
neat? And off in the corner you might see a barbecue. You know, barbecue is such a big thing. I've been in cemeteries up in
Yeah.
Texas. I love it. I'll see a barbecue. I always go and lift the lid, and I'm like, yeah, they've been using this thing. You know, it's
Yeah.
because they're and I've
Back
read
then, it wasn't
historic.
what people think of as being morbid. It was like you said, you're going to spend a day and it's a
Yes,
beautiful park, and dead
yes,
people just happen to be
and
buried there.
well, people forget. So now we have forgotten. This is what we've forgotten. Cemeteries are for the living. Hello.
Hmm.
Yes, you put your dead there, but they are a cemetery is for the living. It's for us. It's for us humans. But what's cool, it's also now because of some of these older places, like if they've been around since 1830 or before, they
Yes.
have heritage plants and bulbs. So people are into old antique roses and things you won't find in a catalog now. So some of these, a lot of these garden cemeteries, they have got arboretum status now because they are like a living library. You can go through
Uh
there and
huh.
see plants and animals that it provides a great uh, when I was younger, I used to think, oh, what a waste of land, a cemetery. When I maybe in
Yeah,
my
of
teens, I
course.
started to think that. And then now I don't think, yeah, at 18, you think a lot of, things. That's one of my thoughts I remember having at one point. Now I think, what a great use of land,
Yeah.
cemeteries. They
Yeah.
keep ugly buildings. If you want to see, take some photos without a bunch of power lines in your way. If you
Yes.
want to see, in Texas, people always love to go out in the springtime and take pictures in sitting around the bluebonnets, but they do it on the side of the highway, and it's
Hmm.
not very nice. You go to a historic cemetery, sit amongst the bluebonnets there, and it's just so much nicer. So that was a big impetus for me to write this book. Was just to kind of reestablish the fact that it's a time-honored tradition to enjoy a cemetery, and that they are for the living, and there's nothing wrong about going there. It's almost taboo for people. They just
Oh,
bury
yeah.
someone. You're sad to get it, but you don't have to be mourning to go there. You don't have to be sad to go to a cemetery. It can
Exactly.
be a, and I know I'm preaching to
Well,
the choir here, but
and it's like what we were talking about. When I go into cemetery now, especially if it's still open and it's accepting like burials, you know where the older part is because the monuments change.
yeah.
Okay, and
Mm-hmm.
then your part, you've got either flat ones or maybe some that are maybe 3 feet tall, a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Once you look in the older is when you start seeing the big monuments, the mausoleums, the family mausoleums. You can
Yes.
tell right away where the older part of the cemetery's at.
And generally it's from after, you can tell when the Great Depression was. So kind of from the 1930s and before,
Mm-hmm.
because during the Great Depression, people had to travel far away to find work. So
Yeah.
before that, people in America were more likely to live in their central family groups, and
Mm-hmm.
you're born in Virginia, you die in Virginia, you have your family plot, you know exactly where you're going to be. And that little family plot, which you'll see in those historic ones, when you see the
Yes.
line around it, well, that's also to let you know exactly what part of the ground you need to tend. So you take care of that, you plant all your plants there, you do whatever you want there,
Mm-hmm.
and then, the next family over knows exactly where they can go. But when after people were moving away to find work, and there was no one to come back and tend their family plots, they had to turn to perpetual care.
Right.
And then also lawn grasses were developed. The lawnmower came along, and things like that. And so they thought, let's just plant them in grass and make it easy so that we can hire someone just to mow over it, and that'll be
Yes.
perpetual care. So it's, that shift. There still are some cool cemeteries, newer ones that still have nice monuments going up, and allow people to more freedom, because a lot of them, they just don't. People say, well, why don't people put up interesting monuments
Right.
anymore? And they just have those flat ones that maybe aren't
Mm-hmm.
as interesting. Well, it's because the rules say it's like a
Yeah.
homeowners association. No, you can't have that. But certain burial areas, burial grounds will allow that, and those are the ones that I love. I think they're most interesting, and that's why I got that whole book of symbols. It's fun to figure out what those truly are messages from the dead. What were they trying to see? What were they trying to tell you? And the more
Right.
I learn about them, the more when I go through a historic cemetery, the more I see. Like a cemetery that I used to think, oh, there's not a lot to see in this cemetery. Now, the more I learn about symbols, I go through and, oh, hey, they've got this
And you
going on. They've
and
got
you
that going on. It brings it to life.
well, and this is the thing because let's face it, you have only X amount of space sometimes to put whatever it
Hmm.
was that you wanted to say about this person, especially if they were
Hmm.
well loved for whatever reason.
Yes.
So yeah, it was sometimes it was just easier, I imagine, to do it with a symbol versus writing out this
Well,
paragraph.
that's the beauty of a symbol. They
Yeah,
are, the old cliche, a picture's worth 1,000 words. But the thing is, you mentioned people choosing. That's more a modern take. Like nowadays, I die, and then my friends trying to decide what symbols to put on. But 100 years ago, and so when I read about people,
mm-hmm.
our ancestors, they were planning their own epitaphs, and they took this quite seriously. So they would be
Yeah,
doing this in their 20s and 30s. And so
right.
if I were a wealthy blacksmith and I started to make some money, I'd be thinking, I think I ought to make a nice family monument. What do you think? My wife or my husband,
Right.
um, and then the family would plan it together. And so I'd read that, their monument was completed, 12 years before anyone actually passed away. But they would, and so they even had a catalog for one of my favorite kind of monuments they're called white bronze, but
Okay.
they're all they did that because it made it sound exciting. White bronze kind of made it sound classier. It's actually a zinc alloy,
Mm-hmm.
and they were put out by the Connecticut, what is it? The Connecticut Monument Company, Bridgeport, Connecticut Monument Company, and you'll see like an obelisk sometimes,
Okay.
and it'll have panels around the side, and people would pick these out of a catalog and order them,
Okay.
and they've held up really well over time. They're beautiful, gorgeous monuments, and so yeah, those are some of my favorites, kind of
Right,
from that
because
era.
on
So,
some of those obelisks, it's exactly like on one side you'll
mm-hmm,
have the memorial for one family member, and
mm-hmm.
then as you go around it at the base, it has a memorial for different members. Like,
Yes.
and this is like that family memorial per se.
And if you tap on it, it's metal. It's probably white bronze, and
Okay.
you'll probably see on there. Sometimes you'll see a little thing that says Bridgeport, Connecticut
Oh, okay, I gotta
Monumental
look at
Bronze
that.
Company on it. Yeah, you got it, and tap on it, and they'll sound hollow, and they're very
Wow.
well. They went out of business after World War One because the war effort needed the zinc
Oh,
for
okay. There you
armament.
go. The war got in the way.
But up until that,
And
they
you
have
know what?
really held up nicely.
I think stuff and I mean lately I've gone to some cemeteries where people, because nowadays some of these memorials are really expensive, and
Yeah,
I've seen where families have made their own version of a
yeah.
memorial. Like I went to one cemetery up in Central Florida. It's a smaller rural cemetery, and they had put the guy's saddle there on
Oh
as part of his
wow,
of it was great. They did it
that's
really
cool.
really nice, and it
I
was like
like
I get.
personality.
Right. Yeah, it's more personalized, and I could see it.
Uh-huh.
You know what? This speaks more than some of these.
It tells you a lot. I know I saw one that had a barrel on it because the person
Yeah.
was a barrel rider. And I'm like, what? And then you go up, and then I saw there was a lasso and other stuff, and I realized,
Yes.
a championship rider. It was kind of cool.
Yes. The
I like when
people
they
are
tell a
taking it their
story.
own personal touch. I think
Yes.
between personalization and cost less, that's why they're going. But you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned something earlier, Tui, which is because that's my that you said look for certain graves sometimes that are different. That there was because we were talking about sometimes when people, if they were objectionable, whether because of who they were or what they did, they kind of like, if you were allowed to be buried in the cemetery, they kind of like put you off or somehow made you look like that there's something wrong with that person. And you were saying something about
Mm-hmm.
even the way if certain graves are facing all in one direction, but you have one that's not.
Yeah, keep an eye out. That's one thing to sort of when you're walking, just something else to keep in mind when you're walking through a historic graveyard is or cemetery. Pay attention to what direction the headstones are facing. So if there seems, it really is varies. There's cultural reasons, and
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of times, this is not. So it's not. I like to say just because it's written in stone doesn't mean it's written in stone. I mean, you have to
Right.
take a lot of these things with a grain of salt. I wrote like what different symbols mean, but I tell people to pay attention to the context.
Okay.
Because the same symbol can mean something different. Are you in a Jewish cemetery? Are you in a Christian cemetery? A good
Right.
example of that is a pitcher. So you see, not like a picture, but like a pitcher you'd pour water. If you're in a Jewish cemetery and someone's headstone has a pitcher on it, that
Mm-hmm.
means they descended from the tribe of Levi, because the
Wow.
Levites washed the priest's hands with water. But
Wow.
if you're,
See.
you know, neat. But if you're in a Christian cemetery and you see a pitcher, that's a really fun one. That's someone you probably want to look up because they put that on the grave of a really righteous woman. So a woman who
Really?
was very, yeah, yeah. In
Okay,
fact,
that's interesting.
fact, she might have checked her dates on her. She might have even been involved in the prohibition movement. Like she might have been a
Mm-hmm.
teetotaler.
Yes.
So
Wow, a teetotaler.
she, yes, she maybe she was an axe wielding, Carrie Nation follower. I
Yeah.
mean, that's someone. Like if you see that, it'll say something. Usually, the epitaph on there will be too. Like she gave her life for others and was really, like whoa, this person was,
That is
practically a
so
martyr.
interesting.
So those, just pay attention to
I
where
love
you
that.
are when I say that, like pay attention to where you are culturally and the time.
Yeah, yeah, because
Like,
like you
oh,
said,
what did she live during Prohibition? That, so there's so many clues, so many layers. Oh, I'm in the Christian section. Oh, this she died during, in the 40s, so she was alive during Prohibition. She, this or that. It was a female. You kind of can. It's fun to puzzle it all together and see what you can find. But yes, so then like pay attention to see how everybody's headstones, they seem to be facing east because they want to be facing east on Judgment Day. Now
right.
sometimes they'll be one will be facing the other way, west, and that
Uh-huh.
might sometimes I have seen this that can be that it's a minister and he wants to be facing his flock. So Judgment
Oh,
Day comes,
okay,
he wants to lead
okay.
all his. So it's not really like there's in like he did something bad, but the thing to look for though,
Is
just I mean, but that's still an interesting story. So if everybody's
yes.
facing this way and then one's facing a different way from everybody, or they're just off in an unkempt area, that one too is like, okay, what happened there? Is that sort of a
Yeah.
potter's field? But if they got enough to have a monument, what's the deal? Are they? Sometimes that's the criminal. Sometimes
Yes.
that is someone who was ostracized in life for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone thought they were a witch. There's might be
Yeah.
some interesting story behind them, sad story perhaps, or just why were they? Because yeah, even in death, we do kind of people can be very cliquish, I guess, for lack of
Yeah.
a word, a better word. So those are ones when you're walking around an old cemetery trying to figure out which one you want to research more. Those probably have stories behind them.
Right,
There's
yeah, it was
one
like
I
the good
saw.
Christian folks said, "We'll bury this person, but we're not happy about it."
Yeah. Well, yeah. In fact, they would even go so far as I know, at least in Europe, around the in the graveyard, if you committed suicide or were some other, had some other blight on your character, in their
Right.
opinion, rather than bring you through the graveyard gates, they
Right.
would pass your body over the north side of the graveyard fence
Really?
as a way to express, there are a lot of ways to express that you were just less
Yeah.
than kosher in their opinion, or less than, I don't know, you were not of upstanding character in their mind.
Right.
So
And that's what we were talking about,
it's
that people don't realize that back then people really cared about that. It was like disapproval even after you're dead. It's
oh, what people really cared about too that always surprises people. I love because I give talks and I love giving talks about cemetery symbols. And one thing that will bring gasps from the audience sometimes, or a couple of them will. Two things actually, pretty much. Let's say you or I were vacationing in some town and we died,
okay.
and they just found us there on the street. We just dropped dead on the street. Back then, you didn't really have ID a lot of times,
Mhm.
and not like we do now. So if you did kinfolk, no one knew who you were. They would just set you in a chair usually in the window of the furniture store, and leave you there in a chair, your dead body, and hope someone would recognize you as you passed
Oh my
by.
god.
And
That's
that's because of,
incredible. Jeez.
I know, but I've read about that enough now that I'm kind of like, oh, okay. But I love, so I forget because I do a lot of research, and then I mention that to a crowd, and they're like, oh, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. I remember I was pretty freaked out when I heard that too.
I know, because
And
you think, God, that what? But you know what? I know there's
it
also
gets
practical.
better or worse. I don't know. Go
I
ahead.
mean, because if you're thinking, because you always think of that, like, you look at the westerns, when they would kill the criminals and they would put them in the pine boxes out in front of the saloon. So, hey, we killed them, watch. But I had never
Yeah.
heard of that. But I know there's
This, I
always a
mean,
practical aspect to it. And I think some of the
mm-hmm.
times is besides the fact that they want somebody to come in so that the townspeople don't have to bury this unknown person because
Yeah.
it costs
Well, and
money.
sometimes I would read about that. Okay, so a lot of times it was a furniture store because a lot of times the
It's
furniture store
incredible.
was also the place that made coffins. If you didn't make your own, a lot of people made their own coffins,
Right.
and then they'd set them in the corner and use them as bookshelves. you know, I mean,
Oh
this is
my
just a normal
God.
person. This isn't nowadays. If you're some person with a coffin in the bookshelf, you're probably kind of goth or
Right,
like,
right,
you've
right.
got
Yeah, like,
skulls
yeah,
on.
but that
It's
was,
part of
that
your
was,
decor. It's a statement. Back then, it's just like, yeah, Grandpa made that. He's using it for his books until his time comes.
it's
It's
like,
not.
yeah.
There were different attitudes they
No,
had.
you have to be practical about things. It's like,
Mm-hmm. You
forget the
really did the
morbidity.
practice.
I mean, you were
Mm-hmm.
oh God, what was it the other day? I can't remember. What town was it, Marlene? I can't remember, but it was where it was a smaller town where the furniture company
Mhm.
used to double as where they would do the wakes. Almost
Oh,
like a,
sure. See, the furniture people.
I
That's
was like,
good.
what? I looked at that and I said, is this a typo? And it's like,
Yeah.
no, they actually, it was like, this is where you would do the
They probably
wake
had a
at the
morgue too.
furniture
Yeah.
company.
Mhm.
And I was like, what? Okay.
Yeah.
Uh,
Because they're already making furniture, and it's just sort of like furniture you're going to put in the ground, so it's a little sideline for them. And they got to branch out. And,
yeah.
coffins weren't mass produced until after the Civil War because that's when we really, really needed it, and people were dying and needing to be
Right.
transported all over America. So, for
Yes.
that, it's just like, then I'll make you a chair, I'll make you a coffin, I'll make you whatever.
Right. It was, I think it was a funeral. It was an obit or something like that. I was
Mhm.
reading it and I was like, what? It's in the what?
Yeah.
In the furniture company? I was like, what is
Those are
that?
little things that kind of makes me sometimes want to make a TV show of old timey, those little historical tidbits to just stick into a TV show that kind of make us go, wow, that are eye opening. That
Yeah.
and it hasn't it's only been like 100 years or so, or 120 years that would have been normal. I mean, wow, have things changed? Oh, here's the other thing that always kind of gets gasps from the audience is that we have a different idea now. Like when you die, on your on my card, on my driver's license, I'm an organ donor. So I
Mm-hmm.
figure if I go and there's anything usable, on me, they can have my usable, what usable?
Yeah.
They can have my corneas or my whatever. Take
Uh
it if you
huh.
want it, take it, and then I haven't decided what to do after that. But I won't need my body, right?
Right.
Well, back in like the 1800s and before that too, they really believed that on Judgment Day, I've seen cases where the person would have a fresh suit, a fresh pressed suit, a change of clothes down at their feet. So on Judgment Day, they could change really quickly into their Sunday
What?
best.
It's like, yeah. Okay.
Now,
That's
I've seen this a
incredible.
few times too. Like,
That is
it gets
incredible.
better. People, if you had to have something amputated, like your arm or your leg or
Right.
whatever, you would bury that next to you because on Judgment Day, you wanted all your parts. You get a buggy accident, you're not going to donate your body. That was a creepy idea to them.
Yes.
They wanted everything, and it was distressing it was distressing to them not to have all their parts on Judgment Day. So it's a different attitude towards. It's very literal about you needing your body. Of
Well,
course you wouldn't be cremated. You want
which
all your pieces.
from what I understand, this is why grave robbing back then, besides the obvious, was so horrendous to them. Because if you're
Mm-hmm.
thinking there's nothing of me left come Judgment Day, I've been taken apart.
There
You
used to be riots in America at medical colleges
really
because there was no legal way for them to obtain cadavers to do studies on. And
right?
so either the students or they would hire somebody, they would look for fresh corpses and within a certain week window. And there was at least 17 different riots that I managed to find out about during the 1800s where people would go. One case really sad. I mean, this man, I just thought about it for me. It would be so distressing. Okay, so, it's one thing to donate your body willingly. All
Mm-hmm.
right. Back then, no one wanted to because you think you need it.
Right.
After you're dead, okay, that's our cultural belief. But there's this conundrum because there's also this rise of um, medicine is trying to become
Mm-hmm.
a thing.
Right.
So this man heard a rumor that he lived in Ohio. He heard a rumor that his daughter's body had been dug up, or it had been dug up, I do believe. So he's trying to track it down. They tracked it down to a medical college. So he and his buddies went to the college and just unannounced and somehow, charged through there. And he found his daughter's hand. I don't know,
Wow.
and it was I can't blame him for going
No.
bonkers. He and his buddies just set the place on fire. I mean, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
They were so upset. So that is something that used to happen before we had a more standardized and a different, the cultural shift had to happen
Right.
too. But so the next thing was they would then use criminals' bodies. So that didn't make donating your body have a higher self-esteem. Not self-esteem, but seem like a good thing either. If only criminals and bodies were being used, it took a mental shift among
Yes.
people. But there were a lot of things too. There's some interesting patents out there for you can search the internet for them. And I have in my book I talk about it a bit too. The exploding coffins, things that would
Are
if
you
you dug them
kidding?
up,
Like a
you
booby
could
trap coffin?
there's pretty cool ones. You can
Oh
see
my
these
god.
old time drawings, figure 1, figure 2, these really elaborate drawings. Another thing they used to
What?
do to avoid, um, the void, they called them the resurrectionists. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of a
Yeah.
cool name. Yeah, so one way to avoid being dug up was they would put them in receiving vaults. So if you're in a historic, this is something to keep in mind. So if you're in a historic graveyard or cemetery and you're wandering around and you see a really old storage shed, but it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of fancy, like maybe it's made of stone or brick and it has maybe, it's just a little fancier than just a garden shed and
Right.
it's fairly large, that may once have been a receiving vault. So sometimes what they would do is number one, well, if you were living north and the ground freezes and you can't, the
Yes,
gravedigger
right. They
can't
can't dig.
dig. If the permafrost happening in the winter, they can't dig your grave. So they would have to store your body until the springtime and then dig. So that was one reason
Mm-hmm.
for the receiving vault. Another reason for the receiving vault, though, was to keep your body until it wouldn't be wanted by a gravedigger. That was another sometimes a strategy. And some cemeteries would hire night watchmen.
Right.
Other cemeteries, of course, so they would then target the where poorer people were buried. So like the more
Right.
country cemeteries and things. So they would do things like alternate dirt with straw because it's harder to dig if you keep hitting straw. The
Okay.
theory was that would slow you down because if you're a grave robber who's going to steal, you got to be really fast
Right.
to
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
so
like
if,
get in
if,
and
if they're
out.
trying, we'll try this one. Oh, it's okay, forget it, let's go over to this one. So that was another, there were a lot of strategies. I really kind of got like into like, wow, this could be a whole book on its own. Pretty much every chapter in my book I felt like, wow, I think each of these, I've got so much research I couldn't stick in the book because I want it to be kind of concise, a good overview, but there's so many little side
Oh
winding
yeah.
roads that I still in research I could dig in literally dig
Well,
into more.
one of the things that I found, because I was doing also research, like after the Civil War, which is when they put up a lot of the big asylums or sanitariums, the
Oh
mental,
yeah.
poor houses slash whatever, that they would just.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Your
what they,
husband's mad at you. He reads too many
yeah,
novels. He
he's
declares you insane,
whatever.
and
I
it's
want
just
to get rid
nuts.
of my wife, which, by the way, I ran across a couple of those stories. I'm
A
gonna say
lot of
she's
them. I know
mentally
those are
ill and commit her, and yeah, and
yes.
move on with my girlfriend to another state, whatever.
Oh,
They would donate. Unfortunately, because many times the families just didn't care, had moved away, they would donate their
mm-hmm.
bodies or give their bodies over to for the
Oh,
universities and things like that.
yeah. Okay.
Because
See.
again, most of the time nobody was there to claim the body, and once
Mm-hmm.
there was nobody there, basically these asylums that were 9 times out of 10 run by the state had the
Mm-hmm.
option of doing whatever they wanted to with the
And
remains.
they can make a little money selling it to the college, and no one's going to come. And
Exactly, exactly. The universities, of
ah.
course, were the big ones because that's where all the medical students were attending.
Mm-hmm.
And refrigeration is not what it is now as far as to keep
Yeah.
a corpse. So yeah, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of the patients that ended up dying in a lot of these asylums, that's where they ended up at. They would be given over to the
Wow.
university for dissection and anatomy, and again, no family there to say, "What are you doing?" So that was the end of that.
Yes.
So
And sometimes I've come across ones where they were trying to defend the criminal. So the family spends all the money on lawyers and everything. And
yes,
then when the person, dies in prison or it doesn't go well, they,
yes,
they can't claim the body. So,
no, and then back then, yeah, people don't realize that uh, sometimes even if you were really really poor, even a simple casket or transporting it was beyond your means. So
yeah.
you really didn't have much choice, and that as a matter of fact, that's where a lot of times you would end up with those paupers graves in some of the cemeteries, even if we're not talking especially
Yes.
if you had somebody die out there where there was no family or the family didn't show up or couldn't have the body shipped back to them. It was like, okay, we need to bury this person. Okay, just put him over there in the corner. So
I know. Yeah, there are. Also, African American slave uh,
yes.
graveyards. They are constantly. I post a lot of this. I have a Facebook page where if
Mm-hmm.
anyone who's watching this wants to post things, interesting graves they've seen, or I post articles. I posted a few recently about just different African American slave cemeteries that have been accidentally discovered
Yes.
recently, even, and
Yes.
now they're trying to preserve them and figure out who's there, and it's really a labor of love for some historians. They've managed to trace some things back and
Yes. Or
figure out
yeah,
who's
they're
buried
doing some
there.
type
And
of what was it in I want to say it's about this came out like less than a year ago. It's got
Oh,
University of Mississippi on their medical
uh-huh.
campus. Same thing. They were doing some type of uh, because back then they would even segregate sometimes the insane asylums, and they were
Oh,
digging up
wow. I hadn't
some
thought of that.
type of the some ground for something. They were going to build something, do something, and they discovered not hundreds, thousands of graves
Oh, wow.
of
Yeah.
these people that were African American that had been in this asylum and had died. And back then,
Mm,
they weren't going to put up any memorials or anything like that. And as time goes
no.
by, and they repurpose the buildings for other things, everybody forgets that that field
Mm-hmm.
out there is
What
littered
a,
with bodies.
yeah.
So yeah, like you're saying, every once in a while they're doing a road or they do something. They start coming up with all these surprise, all these
Yeah.
different.
And some of it, I mean, they're pretty urban areas occasionally. I think I just
Mm-hmm.
saw an article the other day about a place in Brooklyn. You would think they would have found
Yes.
everything in such a population, such a dense population, but they
You know what?
finding cemeteries there.
Most of the times I've run across sometimes the stories, and it's almost like what you said, like the Poltergeist. You know how the Poltergeist movie
Yeah.
they were supposed to
Yeah.
move the bodies, but they never did. It's the same
Mm-hmm.
thing when they start digging up and they come across what they realize it's a cemetery or graveyard. When they go back in the records, they say, "Oh yeah, 100 years ago, supposedly they moved
I know it's almost a
the
cliche, a horror story
yeah they
cliche.
moved
Oh, it's
they
buried on the ancient
moved the
burial
bodies
ground,
to
but
this new cemetery." But let's face it, these businessmen were thinking that's a lot of money. Take a few of them
I
and
just
forget it. Don't worry, don't, it doesn't matter.
I just read an interesting book kind of along those lines. It's called Digging for Daddy, and it's about
Oh,
this woman. She just tried to fulfill a simple, not such a simple quest, but her mom's dying wish was that she lived and her family now live in Texas, but the father was buried up in Chicago, and they
okay,
wanted to get his body transported to Texas and just have everybody all buried in a family plot down there. It's
okay.
easy. They went up. She had attended her father's. He died when she was young, but not that young. I think she was a teenager. I mean, she was. It wasn't like she was so little she couldn't remember anything. And they were part of a church, and so she remembered even who had attended the funeral, and
Okay.
she knew what her dad's headstone looked like, where it was. But it'd been a while since she'd been there. She travels up.
Mm-hmm.
Gets permission to exhume his body. Number one, they had to dig the body. They had to do the digging themselves, like with shovels. They were not allowed to take a backhoe on there because it would have been. They thought that was too destructive for the. Yeah, so that was a big eye opener. So she and her family literally digging that up. They bring it up, and it. Long story short, it is the wrong grave. So they try a whole bunch of. I forget how many graves they dig up, 9 or 10, and they
Huh.
do DNA testing, and they are not. Nobody's buried where they're supposed to be. And every time she arrives, the clergy members of all they're conveniently out of town. Um,
What?
yes,
Oh.
so I'm on an interview, Dad, so I can't talk right now. It's not. Larry's in the other room. Sorry.
It's okay. Don't worry
um,
about that.
it happens.
Believe me,
So
I know.
a lot of usually I make little signs, and I don't. Since I'm down here for the winter, I have all sorts of signs at home that say I'm on air right now or this and that.
Don't
But
worry.
anyway, getting
I've
back to
got
that.
animals. I've got birds. So every once in a while, I'll be doing a
Oh,
show, and my dogs will bark or my birds will go ah. So
oh,
don't
that's
worry about
lovely
that.
about birds. I'm surprised my cat's just staying asleep the whole time we're doing this. Anyway, there's my father-in-law walking around behind us.
Don't
You're on
worry.
the you're on air, Dad. Anyway,
Not to worry.
it was quite a interesting book. If anyone wants to read it, Digging for Daddy, and
So,
because of
in
it,
other
she is
words, what they
going
thought was
through.
going to be a simple "Let's bring Daddy home"
Mm-hmm.
turned out to be that's incredible. Because
Yes,
it makes you wonder what did they do with.
it kind of looks like it was a similar thing. They were supposed to. They just, I think, moved the headstones and then moved the bodies and then resold the plots to other
Mm-hmm.
people over time, and so they started to do it correctly, and some bodies were found, but then they just slacked off, and who knows, and they didn't keep good records, and it's just a big, yeah, it's a really horrifying tale. I just kind of read it one afternoon. I couldn't
Let me
stop. I
tell you
just was
something.
like,
I'm going to
oh,
look that
everything her
up. I'm going
family
to
went
look that
through.
up
Yeah,
because let me tell you
yeah.
something. That just happens to be more common, I think, than people realize. It's just that people never
Mm-hmm.
go back and find themselves wanting or having to do that.
You might want to interview her. She's a really interesting lady. I haven't met her in person,
Yes.
but
God,
She's
that's
really.
like something I bet you
Mhm,
she when they started that it was like this is it takes you off
mhm.
in a direction
It
you never
did.
expect. And
And
then
plus, yeah, they went through huge personal, emotional, duress and personal expense to go up there and get this. Now,
mhm.
because of what they're doing and their tenacity, there is some legislation going through to protect this from happening again. It was not legislated. It was not overseen. It was not. It's something you would think people would be required to keep track of, but it just all fell through the cracks. No one was really keeping track of it, and they were able to. It happens more often than you think, I
Well,
guess.
that's what I was about to
And
say. If
what
you
got
think
me was
that was an
people having.
isolated incident, no,
Yeah, no,
not at all.
that was my big eye opener. That and that they had to do all the digging themselves. Finally, they got some publicity, and a guy came with a backhoe and was able to help in certain areas. But there were still some areas where they had to physically just spend hours. And I just can't. How traumatic would that be? You digging up your own ancestor? I don't know. It would be tough.
Well, about a
So.
year ago in San Francisco, there was a family. They live in the I want to say it's Richmond Heights. They're
Mm-hmm.
doing they're renovating their garage or they're doing something with their garage and they decide they're going to go to Idaho and the workmen when they're digging they find a grave underneath the
Oh.
house. Comes
Mm-hmm.
out it's one of these small coffins. It was a child and it had
Oh
a window
yes.
on it. When they look, it's they have perfectly preserved little blonde girl
Oh my
inside of
gosh,
it
one of those.
holding
Oh.
a rose.
Oh.
So of course
Wow.
they come back and the family gets a hold of the city and the city's like, well, whatever you do whatever you
I
want.
don't know. It's
they
yours.
they put her in touch with this organization which supposedly takes care of burying like unwanted children that don't have families.
Yeah.
But that between the family and the organizations and everybody pitched
Mm-hmm.
in, they start trying to figure out. Comes to find out, originally that whole area had been part of a cemetery. Same story.
Oh.
They had moved
Surprise!
certain bodies, a certain map. I bet you the most
Oh.
economical way. So they left a bunch of these graves in there,
Mm-hmm.
and
No one will ever know.
well, they did. They
They
did
said.
find out. Believe it or not, the
Mm-hmm.
university stepped in and they opened it
Oh
up
wow.
real quick. It was airtight. That's why she was also so well preserved.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Um, they took like a hair follicle
Mm-hmm.
and they were able to, for DNA purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And then they started looking at old maps of the cemetery that used to be there, trying to kind of like narrow down a, because she looked to be like a toddler, like deaths and
Oh.
families.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line, believe it or not, they were able to identify her like a year later, and they were
Oh, that
able
is
to
really neat. I'll
find
have to
her
look for that.
family still living over there in California.
Really? I'm gonna look for that
Yes,
article.
where because of the hair follicle, they were able
Mm-hmm.
to match the DNA because they finally narrowed it down to certain families, and then they
Mm-hmm.
were able to find a living person of the family, luckily, and take a DNA
Wow.
swab and compare it, and that's how they confirmed this is who that little girl was. And it
Oh
turned out
gosh.
it was her great great or grand nephew who was he's an older gentleman now that still lived out in
Mm-hmm.
California. So they
That
were
is
able to
really
do a
neat.
DNA comparison, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you see the picture, she looks like a little doll in this little
Oh, I'm
lead
gonna look for
coffin.
that.
And
Oh.
they had determined that she had died of something what they call miasmus, which is like that basically a
Hmm.
child wastes away. They just for some reason they stop
Oh.
making it. Their body stops taking in nutrients, and
Failure to thrive. Yeah.
she passed away. And
Mm-hmm.
what they were saying was obviously this child was very well loved
Mm-hmm.
because of the way she was buried and everything. And
Mm.
she had a rosary made of eucalyptus seeds. I mean, everything was in there since it was airtight. She was
Oh,
perfectly in
wow.
there.
That's really a historical record as well
Yes,
as
it
burial
is. It
practices. I
is.
mean, it's
And
pretty, from the archaeological standpoint
yeah,
and the historical and the
yes. And
cultural. There's a lot to learn there.
and,
Hmm.
and they said, well, also the family had to be pretty well off, because they were, and
Yeah.
luckily the family member was still living in California, and they were able
That
to
is really
match it up.
great.
And they reburied her because they
Hmm.
had given her before they were, at some point they thought we don't even know where we're going to find her. They had given her the name of Miranda Eve, and
Oh,
they had
okay.
buried her, and then they re did another ceremony, and they filled in
Hmm.
Her gravestone
reinterred or
with,
somewhere.
yes,
Uh-huh.
it was in a different cemetery. I think it's in Colma in California.
Oh yeah, I want to go there.
Hmm.
That's pretty amazing
And I thought it was such a,
graveyard.
it was a really, really interesting story. But
Hmm.
getting back to what we were talking about, that a lot of times these graveyards or these cemeteries, because I'm glad you pointed out that difference for me. These
Not like
cemeteries,
I use them interchangeably, but
you
there
know,
is like a
they,
technical difference if you want to. Mhm.
you know, these people that were doing back then, these businessmen, they were looking at budgets and expediency. They didn't care about sentimental stuff like that was your
Mhm.
grandma, your grandpa, your kid. All they were thinking was,
Yeah.
oh, okay, like take some over there and forget it. If they don't know about it, you
Yeah.
know, and then the next
So
thing you know is you're doing a renovation on your garage and you dig up a coffin. It's like, okay. So there you go.
another person just walked in, so I was like,
Don't worry about it. Well, you know what,
okay.
Tui? Thank you so much for the time you spent for me. This is, I could, if I don't, I could talk and talk hours and hours about this because I
I
think it's
could
so
too.
fascinating about the cemetery symbols. I enjoyed this so much, and I wanted to thank
I
you for
do
the
want to,
time that you
yeah, I
spent.
want to tell people if they want to get just a little brief guide to the meaning of hands in
Mm-hmm.
cemeteries, they can just go by my website, tuisnider.com. You can
Okay.
sign up for my newsletter, which I don't send out that often. And
Okay.
as a thank you, you get a little PDF. And it's just a good way to get started. It tells you what different hands mean. Like, what does it mean pointing up? What does it mean pointing down? You know, when
Yeah.
different types of handshakes, and just a little bit. I have a whole chapter on the hands, but this is just a little thing I like to give out when I give a talk as a
I think
freebie.
that's
So I
great. I
thought
think it's
people might enjoy
fascinating.
it. And then the other thing I wanted to say, drop by my Facebook page. You can just type in
Okay.
grave hour as one word, and it'll pop up. And you can
I
share,
love
like if
that.
you are watching this and you think, oh, I have a symbol, I'm wondering what it means, you can share it there, and me and the community there will help you figure it out. And it's just a fun place. I like it as a
Excellent.
place where I can go and talk about graveyards because I
We'll
like
be
to.
hooking
And
up.
like you, I could talk about this all day, and I appreciate you
I
having me
loved
on.
it.
This was
Thank you.
wonderful.
No, thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend. Bye bye.
You too. Bye bye.
Okay, guys. I love. I'm such a dweeb. I am. I admit it. I'm such a dweeb. Because I think this stuff is so fascinating. To me, it is. It is. It's super fascinating because I feel like I don't know if it's because I do so many visits to cemeteries, um, and you realize these are people, these or were people. I'm saying, uh, sometimes with their own story. Some of them, inevitably we all die, but especially when you look at some of these graves where they were either young or children, it's very sad. Or there's drama sometimes there, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's just ordinary lives that end up where we all end up at dying. But yeah, especially in the older parts, there's a lot of symbology that I myself, I'm going to get that book because there's a lot of stuff that I've seen that I was like, I wonder what that means. And I know it means something. Um, so yeah, for any of those cemetery aficionados, even if you're not a ghost hunter, definitely her book is something to get. I know I'm getting it, like I said, because and even and especially like she said about those graves that sometimes, depending on the reason, but sometimes that they face different ways or slant. Or as a matter of fact, we were talking about it before we started to record, where back then, we're talking, maybe after the Civil War, turn of the century, a little bit. Um, when you died, people even then were they would object to being connected to you even after you died. They didn't want you buried in the same graveyard, or they wanted to shake their finger at you even from the other side, like either burying you in the corner, burying you in a different way. They wanted to and um, castigate the person somehow or other. Uh, in other words, they wanted, and let's face it, nowadays, if you walk into a cemetery, you really don't know by looking at gravestones who was a good person, who was a bad person, who did good things, bad things, whatever. And back then, this they didn't want you to be buried among the good people and for nobody to know that maybe you had done something wrong, whether it was morally wrong or whatever, questionable. It could have been the most simplest thing. They wanted, if anybody visited that cemetery, to know that somehow or other you had been a bad person, or you had did something that was not right. It was like that thing about the Christian symbolism of the picture for possibly a super straight arrow teetotaler woman. I gotta look at that. So guys, I hope you like the show. Please like the video, subscribe to my channel, catch me on Facebook and on Twitter. I stream a lot there. Again, I'm going to put out a call to my true believers, guys. If you've got a story to say, film yourself and send it to me. Go to miamighostchronicles.com. You'll find a connection there. Marlene at miamighostchronicles.com. Uh, you can do it with your phone. If you want to just record yourself into an MP3, tell the story. I get a lot of stories and emails. And I know I'm losing something in translation. Uh, and I promise I'll either include it, the recording, retell it, or just show you actual video of you telling me the story. You know, you don't if you don't want to admit if you want to omit full names, that's fine. However you want to tell the story, it doesn't. You don't have to have experienced it. If it's a family story, the families pass along generation to generation about the haunting at the old farm. I don't care. I'm not out to prove it. I just love hearing these stories about experiences that people have had or their families have had or locations, even if it was something like what she was describing about when she was a kid. She hears something or somebody jumping on the bed. Hello. What is that? I think that was such a great story. And it's almost, how they look at the movies now. Nobody believes the little kid. There you go. Nobody believes the little kid. And she was left to her own devices to confront it. But I think that was an excellent. I love that story. That's what I'm hoping some of you true believers are going to send me. Again, send it to me. I'm really interested in that. So, guys, thank you so much for viewing this or listening on podcasts. Like I said, if you don't find me on YouTube, I'm on iTunes, I'm on Spreaker, I'm on iHeartRadio, I'm on SoundCloud. You can catch the podcast version of this, or you can even go to storiesofthesupernatural.info and you can either listen to the podcast or download it also from there. So either way, however it is that you access us, again, I want to say you have my deepest thanks and please come back.